Hey everyone! So here's my second attempt at a flipped classroom lesson. I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes or so lecturing you on the Cold War. Bear with me. A lot of what I'm going to say is review because I know that last year you spent a lot of time in global studies studying the Cold War. So the Cold War was a non-violent conflict, and that's the key thing. Even though the term is the Cold War, it's cold because there was no violence. No violence, at least directly between the two countries involved. So the Cold War was a non-violent conflict between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, the conflict being based on ideological differences, and a conflict that lasted from right around the end of World War II until 1989. So I use the phrase ideological differences. When I speak about ideology, that has to do with what's a big idea or a philosophical difference. And the major philosophical difference between the U.S. and the Soviet Union has to do with essentially democracy versus communism. So the United States, we are a nation that believes in the spread of democracy. We believe that people should run the government, and we believe people should run the economy. We also believe that the people of the world, the people of every nation, have a right to self-determination, meaning they have the right to self-rule, the right to choose the government they want to have. So our vision of the world post-World War II is for that. That's what we want to see happen and spread around the world. The Soviets don't necessarily agree with that. At that point, World War II, the end of World War II, the Soviets had been a communist country for since 1918, 1919. So communism was firmly entrenched in their government. In a communist government, the government runs the economy. But as you know, in reality, communism doesn't always play out the way it's theoretically intended to. And most communist governments of the world, including the Soviets at that time, had a very dictatorial leader, meaning the people did not really have a role in the government. So the Soviets wanted to see the spread of communism around the world. And the Soviets also wanted the power to create a secure region in Eastern Europe. And this has to do with the fact that the Soviets had experienced World War I and now World War II. They faced a lot of, war, combat, destruction in their region, and they wanted to establish in Eastern Europe alliances with nations that they could be sympathetic with. So in other words, they wanted to see communism spread in Eastern Europe. So I said a lot, but the bottom line is we wanted to see the spread of democracy, and the Soviets wanted to see the spread of communism. And those were two conflicting ideologies. And that conflict forms the basis of the Cold War. So technically, the Cold War doesn't start until after the end of World War II. But there were early signs of conflict even during World War II. The first sign of conflict emerged in January of 1943 when the Allied leaders met in Morocco to discuss war strategy. And the Soviet Union was really pushing the United States to establish a second front during the war. The Soviets felt like a second front in the western part of Europe would take off some of the pressure that the Soviets were facing from Hitler, but the U.S. wasn't able to do that at that time. Eventually, the U.S. did do it in June of 1944 with, D-Day, the D-Day invasion, but it came over a year after the time that the Soviets wanted it to happen. So during the war itself, the U.S. and the Soviets were having conflict with each other. Conflict continued with the Yalta Conference in the spring of 1945. The Yalta Conference was another meeting between the Allied leaders, Stalin, Churchill, and FDR, to discuss what Europe would look like at the end of the war. By the spring of 1945, it was pretty clear that the Allies were going to win the war, and so the Allies were starting to envision what Europe would look like. And there was disagreement over the establishment of the United Nations, and there was also a disagreement about Poland, and that's what I'm going to focus on here. So Poland, as you guys know, was the country that was invaded by Germany on September 1st, 1939, and was the invasion that started World War II. Over the course of the war, with assistance from Russia, the Soviets were able to push out the German forces, and so the Soviet Union established a new government in Poland. So essentially they had a communist government. So the disagreement over Poland at the Yalta Conference centered on whether or not Poland would have... Sorry guys, there's some lawn mowing going on outside. Shut the window. So the disagreement over Poland centered on whether or not there was going to be new elections. The United States wanted there to be new free elections in Poland that would be consistent with our belief in the idea of self-determination. However, the Soviets disagreed with this, and they did not want to see new elections in Poland. So there's a disagreement there. So clearly, the major issue here, and I've reiterated this several times, is that the disagreement between the U.S. and the Soviet Union is over the spread of communism around the world. Our concern over the spread of communism is going to guide how our foreign policy is shaped in the years following World War II. Following World War II, the U.S. foreign policy can be summed up in one word: containment. Our goal is to contain or limit the spread of communism around the world. We are going to allow it to exist where it already is established, but we are going to make foreign policy decisions to prevent the further spread of communism around the world. And in the immediate time period after World War II, we are going to practice containment in two ways. The first way is through the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine is a financial foreign policy program. Essentially, we are going to provide financial aid, money, cash, to any nation in the world that is threatened by communism. And following World War II, Greece and Turkey were both two nations in Europe that were facing an internal threat of communism. And so the U.S. government provided $400 million in aid to both Greece and Turkey, and this aid prevented Greece and Turkey from becoming communist. Another foreign policy program that we adopted in an effort to contain communism was the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was the plan designed to help rebuild Europe in the wake of World War II. We were willing to provide economic assistance to European nations to help them rebuild not only the destruction that occurred during the war, but also money simply to help rebuild their economy. Our belief was that if a nation had a strong economy, it could prevent the spread of communism. We felt nations that had a struggling economy would be more susceptible to communist principles. And so in the years following World War II, the United States invested $13 billion in Western European nations. Actually, it went beyond Western Europe. We offered Marshall Plan financial aid to the Soviet Union, but that assistance was rejected. So we had our policy of containment, but we also needed to think strategically in terms of alliances. And so in 1949, the U.S. established NATO, which stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And this was a formal alliance of the U.S. and several other Western European countries. NATO was an alliance founded on the principle of collective security, which means that we believe that an attack on any one member nation is considered to be an attack on all member nations. The Soviets were not pleased with the formation of NATO. They view that as a threat. And so their response to NATO was to establish an alliance known as the Warsaw Pact with other Eastern European communist nations. So these early developments, the conflicts that existed during World War II, between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and the development of the U.S. containment foreign policy and NATO, these early events all set the stage for the Cold War, which will last for over 40 years until it ends in 1989 with the collapse of communism in Germany. So, you need to keep listening because you're going to have a brief assignment based on this lecture. Your lecture visually has been boring. All you're going to be looking at is this kind of cool image of Uncle Sam and the Russian bear. Here's your task. I want you to take some time. I don't think this should take you more than 10 to 15 minutes. I would like you to put together a Google slideshow of 5 images that I could use in the future to jazz up this lecture. So I want 5 different images. It could be photographs. It could be a chart of information. It could be political cartoons, but I want 5 images that would effectively accompany this lecture in the future to make it a little bit more interesting to listen to and look at. So that's your task, and I'd like you to finish it by the end of the period today. Thank you. Have a good day.